David glanced at the clock on his dashboard. He was late. Again. His heart sank as he thought about Olivia and Max, his two kids, waiting for him at school. It wasn't the first time work had made him late, but today felt different. The traffic seemed endless, and every red light felt like it lasted an hour. David tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, a mixture of frustration and worry creeping in. He had been working overtime for months now. As a single father, life wasn't easy, but he did his best to provide for his children. Olivia, his 10-year-old daughter, loved reading and often teased him about how he was always in a rush. Max, his 7-year-old son, loved superheroes and dreamed of becoming one himself. David chuckled at the thought of his little hero, but the thought of them waiting alone at school wiped the smile from his face. Taking a deep breath, David decided to call the school to let them know he was running late. He fumbled with his phone and dialed quickly. Ms. Henson, their teacher, picked up and assured him the kids were safe in the classroom, but the clock was ticking, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to hurry. To save time, David decided to take a shortcut through a neighborhood he wasn't familiar with. The streets were quieter than usual, and the houses looked worn down, with chipped paint and broken fences. It wasn't the kind of place he would normally drive through, but he didn't have much choice. Every second counted. As he turned a corner, he noticed a police car parked at the end of the street. The officers inside seemed to be watching everything closely, but David didn't think much of it. His focus was on getting to the school as quickly as possible. Still, he couldn't ignore the slight unease he felt driving through the area. It was just one of those days when nothing seemed to go right. David's mind drifted back to Olivia and Max. He thought about how they always ran to him with big smiles when he arrived. He promised himself that no matter how busy life got, he'd always make time for them. They were his world, and he didn't want them to feel like they were ever second to his work. As he turned onto another street, his stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten all day. He shook his head and muttered, "Later. Right now, it's about the kids." The car's engine hummed softly as he sped up, hoping the shortcut would work. Little did David know, his decision to take that shortcut would change the entire course of his day. The quiet neighborhood, the watchful eyes of the police, and the timing of it all were about to collide in a way he never expected. And at the end of this shortcut, trouble was waiting. David noticed the police car in his rearview mirror. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, but something about it made him uneasy. He told himself to stay calm. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just a dad, trying to get to his kids on time. Still, the thought of being watched made his palms sweaty. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and focused on the road ahead. The shortcut seemed to be working. The streets were mostly empty, and he was making good time. But the neighborhood was eerily quiet. Some houses had boarded up windows, and others had overgrown yards. It felt like a place that had been forgotten by time. David shook off the strange feeling and pressed on. Just as he turned onto another street, he noticed the police car in his rearview mirror again. This time, it was moving. Slowly but surely, it was following him. David's heartbeat quickened, though he tried to keep his cool. Maybe they're just patrolling, he thought. Or maybe I'm imagining things. To be safe, David made a few turns, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling. But no matter where he went, the police car stayed behind him. It wasn't speeding or flashing its lights, but it was definitely there. His stomach churned. What did they want? Had he done something wrong without realizing it? He started running through everything in his head. His car registration was up to date. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't on his phone. He hadn't broken any laws. So why were they following him? The questions raced through his mind, but there were no answers. As he approached a stop sign, David decided to play it safe and pulled over to the side of the road. He figured if they wanted to pass him, this was their chance. But instead of driving past, the police car pulled over right behind him. His heart dropped. This was no coincidence. David watched nervously As the officer stepped out of the car and approached his window, the man's face was serious, and his hand rested on his belt. David quickly rolled down his window, trying to appear calm even though his hands were trembling. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said. "Can I see your license and registration?" David nodded, his voice shaky as he replied, "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced into David's car, his eyes scanning every detail. David handed over his license and registration, his mind racing. "Please, let this be a misunderstanding," he thought. The officer took the documents and said, "We've had some suspicious activity in the area, and your car matches the description of a vehicle we're investigating." David froze. Suspicious activity? What were they talking about? He was just a dad, rushing to pick up his kids. But now, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. David's heart pounded as the officer's words sank in. His car matched the description of a suspicious vehicle. How was that even possible? He wasn't a criminal. He was a dad, just trying to get to his kids. But as the officer stood there, waiting for a response, David realized he needed to stay calm. Getting upset wouldn't help. "Officer, there must be some mistake," David said, his voice steady but nervous. "I'm just on my way to pick up my kids from school. That's all." The officer raised an eyebrow, still scanning David's car as though expecting to find something out of place. "We're just doing our job, sir," he replied. "There's been a string of burglaries in the area, and we're checking every lead. Your car matches the description we were given." David felt his stomach twist. He wanted to argue, to tell the officer how ridiculous this was, but he knew better. Instead, he forced a small nod. "I understand. I'll cooperate with whatever you need." The officer seemed to relax slightly at David's calm tone. He stepped back and spoke into his radio, relaying information about David's car and license plate. David sat stiffly in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on him, their curiosity obvious as they slowed down to watch the scene unfold. Minutes felt like hours as the officer finished his radio call and returned to David's window. "Step out of the car, please," he said, his tone firm but not aggressive. David hesitated for a moment, then opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The cool air hit his face, but it did little to calm his racing thoughts. "I can show you my phone," he said quickly. "I just called the school to let them know I was running late. My kids are waiting for me. I don't have anything to hide." The officer held up a hand to stop him. "We'll get to that. Just stay where you are for now." David watched as another police car pulled up behind the first one. Two more officers got out, their expressions serious. It was starting to feel like a scene from a bad dream. David wanted to shout, to explain himself, but he knew he needed to stay composed. Any sudden move could make things worse. As the officers began to inspect his car, David felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He thought about Olivia and Max, still waiting for him at school, wondering why their dad hadn't arrived yet. His heart ached at the thought of them waiting. "I just need to get to my kids," David said quietly, almost to himself. One of the officers glanced at him but said nothing. They were too busy checking every corner of his car, looking for evidence that didn't exist. David could only stand there, helpless, and hope that the truth would come out soon. David stood by the side of the road, his hands trembling as the officers continued their search of his car. Every passing second felt like an eternity. He couldn't believe what was happening. This was supposed to be a regular day, just a quick drive to pick up Olivia and Max from school. Now he was being treated like a criminal. The officer who had spoken to him earlier walked over, his expression unreadable. "Sir, do you mind telling me exactly where you were earlier this afternoon?" David swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was at work. I left as soon as I could to pick up my kids. That's all." You can check with my office if you need to." The officer nodded but didn't say much. Instead, he turned back to his colleagues, who were still inspecting David's car. David felt his frustration building. He knew he wasn't guilty of anything, but proving that to the police seemed like an uphill battle. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia and Max were sitting in their classroom, waiting. Ms. Henson, their teacher, tried to reassure them. "Don't worry, kids," she said with a warm smile. "I'm sure your dad will be here soon." But Olivia wasn't so sure. She kept glancing at the clock, her worry growing with every passing minute. Max, sensing his sister's unease, leaned over and whispered, "Maybe he got stuck in traffic." Olivia nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't go away. Back on the street, David's mind was racing. He felt helpless and trapped. The officers weren't being aggressive, but their suspicion was clear. He thought about calling someone for help, but who would he call? He didn't want to worry his kids or burden anyone else. "Officer, please," David said finally, his voice breaking a little. "I'm not who you're looking for. My kids are waiting for me, and they'll be scared if I don't show up. Can't you check with the school? I called them just before you pulled me over." The officer looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "We're following procedure, sir. If everything checks out, you'll be on your way soon." David nodded, though the words didn't bring him any comfort. His heart ached at the thought of Olivia and Max waiting for him, wondering why he hadn't come. He could picture their little faces, full of worry, and it made him feel powerless. As the officers wrapped up their inspection, one of them spoke into his radio. David couldn't hear what was being said, but he could tell they were still discussing him. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, silently praying that this nightmare would end soon. But as the minutes dragged on, David couldn't help but wonder, how had his life taken such a turn? All he wanted was to be there for his kids, but now it felt like everything was spinning out of control. The officers continued to speak in low voices, their attention focused on David's car. He stood there, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, trying to steady his breathing. The longer the officers took, the more anxious he became. Every minute that passed felt like a weight on his shoulders, and his thoughts kept drifting back to Olivia and Max. What were they thinking right now? At the school, Olivia sat at her desk, nervously tapping her pencil against the table. Max was quieter than usual, but she could see the concern on his face too. They both knew their dad should have been there by now. It wasn't like him to be late, especially when it came to picking them up. "Miss Henson," Olivia said, her voice a little shaky. "Isn't it strange that Dad isn't here yet?" Miss Henson smiled gently, trying to ease Olivia's worry. "I'm sure he's just stuck in traffic, sweetie. He'll be here soon. Let's wait together, okay?" Olivia nodded, but she didn't feel better. Something didn't sit right with her. It wasn't just the worry in her stomach. It was the feeling that something was off. Olivia glanced at the clock again, her mind racing. Why wasn't her dad here? Where was he? Just then, Ms. Henson's phone rang. She picked it up and listened carefully, her face changing from calm to concerned. Olivia watched her teacher, feeling a pang of fear in her chest. Max, sensing his sister's unease, whispered, "What's wrong?" Ms. Henson turned toward them and said in a quiet voice, "Olivia, Max, I need to make a call. Wait here for just a moment, okay?" Olivia didn't say anything, but her thoughts were spinning. What was going on? Why had Ms. Henson looked so worried? Meanwhile, David stood on the side of the road, still under the watchful eyes of the officers. He felt like a spectator in his own life, as though everything was happening to him, but he had no control over it. He wanted to scream, to tell them everything, about his kids waiting for him, about how he was just a father trying to do the right thing. But just as David thought he couldn't take it anymore, something unexpected happened. The officer who had been checking his car came back with a new look on his face, a mix of confusion and apology. "Sir," the officer began, "we've just received some new information." David's heart skipped a beat. Was it finally over? Had they figured out the mistake? Before he could ask, the officer continued, "It turns out you're not the person we were looking for. We've been in contact with a witness who saw you at the school earlier, and it's clear that you're not involved in the crimes we were investigating." David felt a rush of relief flood over him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel like he could breathe again. But before he could say anything, the officer added, "I apologize for the confusion, but you'll need to come with us to clear everything up." David's stomach dropped. It wasn't over yet. His kids were still waiting, and he still had to explain everything to them. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He stood there, trying to process the officer's words. "You're not the person we were looking for." A wave of relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by frustration. Why had this happened? Why hadn't they figured this out sooner? His mind immediately shifted back to Olivia and Max. They were still waiting at the school, likely getting more and more worried with each passing minute. He was so close to seeing them, but now, the officers were still insisting he come with them to clear everything up. "I just want to go get my kids," David said, his voice a little shaky. "Can't you tell me what's going on? I'm not involved in anything you're investigating." The officer looked at him with a mix of sympathy and professionalism. "I understand, sir, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but we still need to verify a few things before we can let you go. It's just protocol." David's frustration grew, but he tried to keep calm. "Protocol," he repeated, trying to control the rising anger in his voice. "You've already checked my license, my registration, and my phone records. I'm just a dad, officer. All I want is to pick up my kids. They're waiting for me." The officer hesitated before responding. "I know, sir, and I'm sorry for the delay. We've contacted a witness at the school. She was able to confirm your story. It turns out this whole thing was a misunderstanding." David's shoulders slumped in relief. A witness. He felt a sense of hope that he might finally be able to leave. "Who was the witness?" David asked. "How did they know I was telling the truth?" The officer nodded. "A teacher from the school, Miss Henson. She confirmed that you called ahead and that you were expected at the school to pick up your kids." David felt his chest lighten at the mention of Miss Henson's name. That was a huge relief. She was a trusted figure in the school, and her word could clear up everything. Still, there was something bothering him. Why had the officers taken so long to contact her? As if reading his mind, the officer spoke again. "We didn't know the full story until we made a few more calls. We're sorry for the confusion." David nodded, though he still felt shaken by the whole ordeal. He tried to remind himself that it was almost over, but the damage had already been done. He could only imagine how his kids were feeling, left in that classroom without knowing where he was. "Can I go now?" David asked, his voice calmer but tired. The officer gave him a small nod. "Yes, sir. You're free to go. But please, try to stay on the main roads next time. We're just being cautious, but I understand this has been stressful for you." David didn't say anything in response. He just needed to get to the school. He was done with the confusion, the questions, the waiting. He needed to hold his kids, to reassure them that everything was fine. With a deep breath, he got back into his car and started the engine. He glanced at the clock. It was later than he had hoped, but he was finally on his way. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove toward the school. He had just been cleared, but the stress of the past hour still hung over him like a heavy cloud. All he could think about was Olivia and Max, waiting for him, wondering why he hadn't shown up yet. His foot pressed harder on the gas pedal as he turned onto the familiar street, his eyes scanning the road ahead for the school. He could picture the playground where he usually picked them up, the same place where they ran to him every day with bright smiles. It had always been his favorite part of the day, but now, all he felt was a deep knot in his stomach. What would they think? Would they be scared? Or worse, would they be angry with him for being late? When David finally reached the school, He saw Miss Henson standing outside the front doors, her face full of concern. Olivia and Max were beside her, sitting on the steps. Olivia's eyes were wide, and Max looked down at the ground, his small shoulders hunched. David could see the worry written all over their faces. They hadn't even noticed him pulling up. He parked the car quickly, his heart racing in his chest. He threw open the door and rushed toward them, not caring about anything else in that moment. As soon as they saw him, Olivia stood up, her eyes filling with tears. "Dad," she cried, her voice shaking with relief. Max jumped up too, his little arms wide as he ran to David. David crouched down just in time to catch him, his son's small body colliding with his chest. Max buried his face in David's shirt, his little hands clutching at his father's jacket. "I'm so sorry I'm late, buddy," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He kissed the top of Max's head before pulling back to look at Olivia, who was standing quietly nearby, watching him with wide, searching eyes. David reached out his hand, and Olivia stepped forward slowly, wrapping her arms around his neck. He held her close, her small body trembling in his arms. "I was so scared," Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. "Where were you, Dad? Miss Henson said you were coming, but you never came. We waited so long." David felt his heart break a little. He pulled Olivia closer, brushing his hand through her hair. "I'm sorry, sweetie," he said softly. "There was a mix-up, but I'm here now. I'm never going to leave you waiting like that again." Miss Henson, who had been standing quietly off to the side, gave them a warm, understanding smile. "I'm glad you're back, David," she said. "Your kids have been waiting so patiently. It's good to see you together again." David nodded, grateful for her kindness. But it was Olivia and Max he needed to reassure now. He could see the worry still lingering in their eyes. He knelt down to look at them, his voice steady as he said, "Everything is okay now. No one is going to take me away from you, okay?" They both nodded, their faces slowly relaxing into smiles. The tension that had filled the air seemed to melt away with each word. "I'm so proud of you two for being so brave," David added. "Now how about we grab some ice cream on the way home?" Max's eyes lit up, and Olivia smiled for the first time all day. "Ice cream?" she asked, her voice bright again. "I'd love that." David stood up, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He was finally back with his kids, and nothing else mattered. As they all walked toward the car together, David felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. Today had been difficult, but it was a reminder of how much his family meant to him, and how far he would go to be there for them. The car ride home was filled with laughter, the tension that had hung over the day finally lifting as David drove. Olivia and Max were chatting excitedly about everything they had done at school. Max was talking about a new superhero comic he had gotten, and Olivia was telling her dad all about a book she was reading for class. Their voices were bright, and the happiness in their tone made David's heart swell with relief. He glanced at them in the rearview mirror and couldn't help but smile. It felt good to see them so carefree again. He had been so worried about them earlier, but now everything was back to normal. For now, at least. David turned the car into their neighborhood and pulled into their driveway. He parked the car, still feeling the lingering stress of the afternoon. He had been so shaken by the misunderstanding with the police that he hadn't fully processed what had happened yet. All he knew was that he needed to make sure nothing like that ever happened again. His kids deserved better than that. As he opened the car door, he turned to Olivia and Max. "How about we have a little family movie night?" he suggested, trying to make the evening feel special after everything that had happened. Olivia's face lit up, and Max immediately started bouncing in his seat. "Yes, can we have popcorn?" he asked eagerly. David laughed and nodded. "Of course, we can have popcorn." As they made their way inside, David was already thinking about what he needed to do next. The whole incident with the police had shaken him more than he had expected. He was just a dad, trying to do right by his kids, but being stopped, questioned, and treated like a suspect had been a wake-up call. He didn't want to feel powerless again. He didn't want to be caught off guard when the world suddenly turned against him. As he prepared dinner later that night, David couldn't shake the thought that he needed to take action. He needed to make sure something like this didn't happen to him, or anyone else, again. While Olivia and Max were happily settled on the couch watching their movie, David pulled out his phone. He had an idea. He began typing an email, his fingers moving quickly across the keys. The words spilled out of him as he explained what had happened, how he had been treated, and how important it was for people to be treated fairly. He didn't want to lash out, but he did want to be heard. This had been a mistake, yes, but it was a mistake that shouldn't have happened in the first place. Once he was done, David read over the message. It was simple, clear, and direct. He wasn't angry. He was just asking for accountability. With a deep breath, he hit send. He knew this wouldn't change the past, but it might just help someone else in the future. David leaned back in his chair, feeling a little better. He couldn't control what happened that afternoon, but he could make sure it didn't happen again. And that was enough for him. The rest of the evening passed by in a blur of laughter, popcorn, and warmth. David held his kids close, reminded once again of how precious these quiet moments really were. He would never take them for granted again. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew he would face them with strength, and with his family by his side. The next few days were quieter for David. The incident with the police had left him shaken, but as the days passed, he began to feel like things were returning to normal. He focused on his work and made sure to spend extra time with Olivia and Max. They needed to know they were his top priority, no matter what happened. One evening, as he sat on the couch with his kids, watching a movie, David's mind drifted back to the confusion and worry he had felt that day. He had never imagined something like that could happen to him. It wasn't just about the mix-up with the police. It was the feeling of being powerless, like he was at the mercy of something he couldn't control. But through it all, his children had been the ones who had kept him grounded. Olivia, with her thoughtful nature, and Max, with his boundless energy, had reminded him what really mattered. They had been so strong, waiting for him with patience, even though they didn't fully understand what was going on. It was a lesson David would never forget. As the movie ended, Max jumped up from the couch, already thinking about what to do next. "Dad, can we go to the park tomorrow? I want to ride my bike," he asked excitedly. David smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that came with being around his kids. "Sure, buddy. I think that's a great idea," he replied, ruffling Max's hair. Olivia, who had been quietly sitting beside him, looked at her dad with a serious expression. "Dad, are you okay? I know you've been a little quiet lately." David paused, surprised by how well Olivia could sense when something was off. She had always been perceptive, her quiet strength a source of comfort in times like this. He took a deep breath and looked at her, her big brown eyes full of concern. "I'm okay, sweetie. Just thinking about some things," David said softly. "I don't want you two to ever feel scared or worried like you did that day. I want to be strong for you, and I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. Always." Olivia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I know, Dad. I'm glad you're here." Max, not quite understanding the deeper conversation, piped up, "Can we go get ice cream after the park?" David chuckled. "Yes, we can. Ice cream it is." The next day, they spent the afternoon at the park. Max rode his bike while Olivia played on the swings. David watched them from a nearby bench, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in days. The world was chaotic, but these small moments with his kids made it all worthwhile. They didn't need fancy gifts or big adventures, just their dad and each other. As the day came to a close and they sat down for ice cream, David reflected on how lucky he was. The events of the past week had been tough, but they had only made his bond with Olivia and Max stronger. He knew they would face challenges ahead, but as long as they had each other, they would be okay. David was more determined than ever to protect his family, to be the strong father they deserved. And no matter what happened in the future, he knew he had the strength to handle it, because his love for his children was the strongest thing in the world.